professional school counselor as case manager. So you should now be able to see my presentation. And here we go. So welcome to everyone who's coming in. I know folks are still trickling in, and that is great. I understand that for most of you, this is towards the end of your school day. You might have other things going on and some distractions. Just know that I'm attentive to that. So my name is Marinda Peters. I am a civil rights specialist with the ODE. If any of you all knew Winston Cornwall, I took his position in retirement, and I offer that same support and service to districts. So I really work specifically with protected classes under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. So that's race, color, national origin, and Section 504 and Title II of the ADA, which is disability. So I come to you with 17 years of experience in public education, primarily as a school counselor. And I worked on 504 and 504 plans in my role as a school counselor as well. And as a school counselor, I worked at the primary and secondary levels, as well as served on the OSCA board. And eventually got my PhD in counseling. So I teach periodically in school counseling programs throughout the state. So some of you all are familiar faces or names because of the work I've done with the university system as well. So my hope is that I can come to this training, this webinar, with both wearing the school counselor hat and this extra layer of 504 that's often put on our plates, and we don't always feel like we're ready to jump into that or understand that role completely. Please know that I come as a representative of the Oregon Department of Education, and we work with all 197 school districts. So when you have questions about Section 504, no matter which district you're with, I am your specialist in that area. And we serve a diverse student body as a state, and it's becoming more diverse as we go. So when we're talking about disability and disability civil rights today, I just want you all to kind of couch that idea that our students come to us with multiple identities and maybe kind of exist within multiple protected classes. So we want to just recognize the diversity that our student body and our staff body also represents in the state. And then I just want to acknowledge this is not legal advice. So this is technical assistance and training. If you are starting to have questions about your district's policies and procedures, you would want to consult with your district and their legal counsel. That is not my role within the agency. And just for some norms for our group today, please use Zoom etiquette, so stay mute. We have a large group today, already at about 135 participants and going up.
No, I don't know how it's just on my calendar.
And you need to use the chat function to respond to or ask questions. And we do have Beth Wiggum here, who is monitoring the chat. And so she will be sure to share out those questions as they come along. And then I'm going to just ask that you use kind of conference etiquette as well. So if you're going to ask questions in the chat, make sure they're relevant to the content, they're relevant to all participants. And if you need additional consultation, to reach out to me separately. And then just take care of yourself and your learning. So if you need to step out because of a student issue, biological break, do what you need to do, just mute yourself and we'll continue on our way. Because we're kind of jam-packed full of content today, there might be questions that I'm unable to get to. And I just want to acknowledge that there are other ways besides email, which is fine. You can email me or call me. But I also am offering office hours once a month. So the next, second Tuesday of May would be the next one that would be available. And you can Zoom in with any questions or consultations you would like during those times as well. So today, what we are going to cover is the history and the purpose of Section 504, some basics, because we all come to this type of training at different levels. Some of us are very familiar and some are less familiar. And then the roles and responsibilities of 504 coordinators and case managers. And with whatever time is left, we might be able to get to additional questions. I will put the Zoom link for office hours in towards the end. If Beth, you could remind me, that way I can grab that link and put it in and not slow us down right now. This presentation Beth, would you have the presentation also, like the PDF, available for folks? Because all of those links are live within the presentation, so you should be able to link into anything that's that is a link in here. Okay, so first and foremost, when we're talking about Section 504, we really need to ground ourselves in the idea of what it really is about and the purpose. And until we really look at it as civil rights law, we get lost in the conversation around accommodations and what's this and that and plans, and we have forgotten the reason why we have Section 504 to begin with. So we're going to start in that kind of framework and mentality. So with that said, this is a disability educational civil rights timeline that just kind of helps guide us in this conversation. Brown versus Board of Education was really the first time that districts were including young people with pervasive intellectual disabilities. Before that, there was pretty much an isolated and excluded group of students with disabilities that were not served within our public education. In 1973, the Section 504 of the Rehab Act was passed, and that is the act that forbids discrimination based on disability. So it is in that language that says any institution that receives federal funds may not discriminate, and specifically for school districts also requires access for student access to a free appropriate public education. 1975 passed the Education for Handicapped Children Act, which then in 1990 became IDEA. So we see how that developed over time. In 1990, the ADA also passed, which extended civil rights for civilians. And so with the ADA came more language regarding disability and how we define that. So even though the civil rights protections already existed, they were written in 1973 and regulations were pushed out in 77. The language that we continue to develop around disability and how we perceive what a disability is and what a substantial impairment is became refined through ADA and the ADA Amendments Act. So if we start over time to hear changes in vocabulary, it's because it's become more and more refined over time, even though 1973's basic standard of non-discrimination has remained the same. So what is Section 504? Basically, it's a civil rights protection that says no otherwise qualified individual with a disability in the U.S. shall solely because of the reason of their disability be excluded from the participation in, denied benefits of, or subjected to discrimination under any program receiving federal financial assistance. And we'll jump into what those types of programs could be. Additionally, Section 504 requires schools to provide students with a free appropriate public education, or what we'll continue to refer as FAPE, regardless of the nature of the disability that the student has. So just to also be really clear about what Section 504 is and isn't compared to ADA and IDEA special education, IDEA special education is a formula grant program. There are monies associated with IDEA special education that provide specially designed instruction. So a student to qualify under IDEA must require specially designed instruction and fit within the 13 disability categories outlined by IDEA. And because of that, their disability adversely affect academic performance. So that's why they need specially designed instruction. With Section 504, this is access law and procedural safeguards. So it's really providing equal access to educational benefit. And we're not talking about disability within categories. So a student might need to fit within within one of the 13 categories for IDEA. With Section 504, we're not looking at that. We're looking for a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. And so that really broadens that definition of disability. And then Title II of the ADA extends these provisions out, but it does not have an individual service plan component, so there's no accommodation plan. But your districts are required to have ADA coordinators to make their buildings accessible to all civilians who are accessing or meetings or what have you. All components of the school system needs to be accessible to all civilians to participate. It is true that students served under IDEA are also protected under Section 504. So the non-discrimination policy of Section 504 exists for students who are served under IDEA. We just typically don't have two separate eligibilities. We assume that students who are served under IDEA experience disability, and so they receive Section 504 protections. So who are protected, which students are protected under Section 504? I referenced this. The student needs to have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, or have a record of such impairment. So a student can qualify under Section 504 for, let's say, leukemia in remission. That is a record of that impairment. It may be in remission, but they may still be protected under Section 504. Or being regarded as having such an impairment. For example, we might not have a student that's diagnosed with ADHD, but the school system really regards the student as having ADHD, then they would be protected under Section 504 non-discrimination law. So what it gets confusing is, does there need to be an educational impact? Because I sometimes hear that students are not qualifying under Section 504 because there's no educational impact. The way to best think about this is to think about a really obvious disability that we can see. So if a student was confined to a wheelchair, let's say, we would, and they needed access to the school building, and maybe they needed to not be penalized for coming in late to class because it took them longer to get through the hallways, and maybe they need some assistive devices, but that student receives A's and B's. We would never say that they don't qualify under Section 504. We'd say, of course, they receive Section 504 protections and needs a service plan to access their education. The same is true for students with hidden disabilities. So a student with anxiety disorder, dyslexia, ADHD, any of the hidden disabilities, there also is not a requirement of educational impact, in the sense that that student could get A's and B's, but they might have to work harder, put more effort in, what have you, to gain access to their education. But a student who is successful academically, that is not exclusionary when it comes to Section 504. We are looking at civil rights protections for those students with a substantial impairment to a major life activity, whether it's walking or concentrating or reading or whatever. So who is responsible under Section 504? It's any institution that receives federal funds. So that is our public school system. It's also our charter schools. So we have public charter schools in the state, and they have the same responsibilities as a typical public school. Magnet programs, so some districts have robust magnet programs. Those students are still protected within those programs and needs to have equal access to those programs. After school programs, so if you have an after school club, utilizing the school's building, maybe utilizing nutrition services for snacks, that would be, they have to adhere to 504 regulations. Athletics also, so OSAA has requirements, nutrition services, so USDA has requirements. So all of these federally funded institutions must adhere to Section 504 regulations. And when are these protections in place? They're in place every single part of the student's educational experience. Okay, so we often think about the academic, but here in the US, the student's educational experience starts from the time that they get on that school bus to the time that they leave the school, the time that they participate in field trips and fun school activities. So we're not just talking about the academic experience, we're talking about the educational experience. So these protections are in place during their class time, no matter the rigor of the course. So if they have honors classes or AP classes, they still receive federal civil rights protections. During the meal times, during fun Fridays, during after school activities, during athletic events, field trips, school events like assemblies, maybe career days, what have you. Those protections are in place for those students during all of those times because that's the entire educational experience. So we cannot deny a student access of benefit from any part of their education. So I'm going to read a scenario and you're going to think, could this be a civil rights violation? Remember, we're couching this idea of Section 504 as civil rights law. That's the primary reason it exists. So this student is an 8th grade student who has juvenile arthritis and a substantial impairment in most fine and gross motor skills. So the movement is painful at times and sometimes limited. The PE teacher requires the student to do a 1-mile run every day at the beginning of PE class. If students complete the run without resorting to a walking pace, they're excused from the run on Fridays. Students who walk must do the run on Fridays plus 10 sit-ups, 10 push-ups, and 5 burpees. The student with juvenile arthritis has been required to do the Friday runs and workouts because she always does the run at a walking pace. However, the PE teacher excuses her from having to do the burpees. So I want you to think for a minute, this student and their educational access and their substantial impairment to a major life activity, could this be a violation to the student's civil rights? Now we're going to read another one. A 2nd grade student has ADHD and has a substantial impairment in executive functioning. To motivate the students and encourage good work ethic, the teacher has a policy that if students complete all their classwork on time for the week, they can participate in Fun Friday and play games and eat snacks for half an hour before the end of the school day. Students who do not complete their work on time use the time on Friday to catch up and finish and turn in incomplete classwork. The student with ADHD is never able to participate in Fun Friday all year and has stayed at his desk to continue to work on his assignments. So let's think about that scenario. This student has a substantial impairment in executive functioning and does not have access to Fun Friday. So one has more of a disability that the folks can maybe observe. I think most folks would say, yeah, that PE teacher probably should have accommodations for a student with juvenile arthritis. We shouldn't deny or maybe require extra work for the student because she has juvenile arthritis. That case is really no different than the ADHD case, right? The student has substantial impairment in executive functioning. He's denied access to the benefit of Fun Friday because he is unable to do the same work without accommodation. And he is missing out on a social part of his educational experience. So as you're thinking about your students and how we support them through their educational experience, remember that Section 504 is about non-discrimination, and that's really important as we're supporting the students to gain access to educational benefit. Both of these could be complaints, discrimination complaints, and that could go through the local level, so through school board policy. They could also go to the Office for Civil Rights, which is the federal level of complaint for civil rights for students in education. Okay, so that's that kind of the couching this idea that Section 504 is about federal civil rights for students with disabilities. The rest of this is kind of the nitty gritty parts of it. But before we jump into that, Beth, do we have any questions that have come up?
We do. Yeah, there's one that's come in and it's asking if you could please help define and clarify a little more around the regarded as such an impairment rules. So for example, a student has no medical diagnoses. Do we not visually see an impact in school, but parent says the student has anxiety or needs additional time for assignments and test quizzes? How do we shuffle out of the idea of that the student qualifies? Is it just based on parent word if we do not see any impact and there is no medical diagnosis?
So I'm going to get through the Section 504 basics and see if we can answer that question throughout that. And then if it doesn't seem clear, then I'll try to clarify more deeply. Because that's a big question because it has multiple layers, right? What about diagnoses? What about data to inform whether a student is substantially impaired? So we're going to see what we can do through a little bit more scaffolding, and then I'll try to summarize. Okay, so Child find is the first and foremost important responsibility when it comes to locating and identifying students with disabilities. So the district is responsible for finding any student in the attendance area who may experience a disability and is not receiving FAPE. So families need to be notified that they can gain access to an evaluation and FAPE, and any person can refer a student for Section 504. So that could be a teacher referral, parent referral, provider referral. The data can refer a student, right? We have lots of data that exists within our school systems, and they might indicate a disability. And so that is child find. That is the responsibility of the team to determine what kind of evaluation we're going to proceed with. So we might proceed with an evaluation towards special education, or because the student needs specially designed instruction, or a team may determine that the student requires access to educational benefit and could receive support through Section 504 and that accommodation plan. So it is the district's responsibility to locate these students. Systems need to be involved to find them, and then we evaluate and offer them support. Where I see a lot of error in this is requiring, or not requiring, but like falling back only on parent referral. So if we only notice the students with disabilities because the parents have said my student has a disability or an impairment, and they're like, okay, we'll evaluate for 504, then we are potentially not ignoring, but not realizing that there are multiple other students within our institutions that may also be experiencing disability. They just didn't have a parent's voice to request support and evaluation. So the system is responsible to locate those students. It is fine to take a parent referral, but that's not going to be robust enough in child find standards to locate students with disabilities. So we talked about what constitutes a disability. It's a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And in 2008, during the Amendments Act, Congress said physical or mental impairment, that list is non-exhaustive. So sometimes we've seen like these lists of like, it could be endocrine or neurological or immune system. Those are examples, but it's hard to know what all of the physical and mental impairments that exist out there. So Congress said, that list is non-exhaustive. And then Congress went on to say that those major life activities are also non-exhaustive because we don't know what all of those could potentially be. And for different people, there might be different priorities and what really is a major life activity. So it could be learning or working or concentrating or thinking or walking, but it could be something else that we haven't ever listed out in any kind of documented way. And again, students can be 504 eligible no matter what their grades are, because we're looking at a substantial impairment, and that substantial impairment could be time and effort that it takes that student to do that major life activity. And that major life activity may not be directly related to, let's say, learning or working or reading. It could be walking or sleeping or something like that. And then there's this cautionary note that says, we're not going to rely on a doctor's diagnosis to be that threshold for which when a student can become eligible or considered for Section 504. So the Office for Civil Rights, who oversees the regulations regarding Section 504 and civil rights violations, has made a statement that says, a doctor's diagnosis is not a precondition to a student having a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. If you need a diagnosis from a diagnostician, it is the district's responsibility to secure that diagnosis, which then means that we are responsible to pay for that diagnosis. So if the only way to determine that a student has a substantial impairment is through a doctor's, records or medical statement, and you say that to the parent, you've obligated the district to pay for that. So there are other ways that we can evaluate for students and knowing what kind of impairments they're experiencing with or without a doctor's diagnosis. Okay. Any questions coming up yet?
Yes, Marinda, we got one that's asking for clarification. Not quite really understanding what the location process is with child find. At their school, Child Find refers to meetings that only occur for students who have attempted suicide or are returning from intensive treatment. And even then, only IEP referrals are discussed in those meetings.
So Child Find in and of itself is defined as identifying and locating students experiencing a disability who need access to FAPE. Okay, so it's all the activities that we engage in to locate students. So there really should be notification that's released by the district that says, hey, if your child is experiencing a substantial impairment to major life activity or disability, we will evaluate for access to a free appropriate public education. And that also means that the data is potentially instigating Child Find, right? So if the data says this kid has chronic absenteeism, and then we look and we say, oh, they're absent because of a chronic health disorder, then that instigated Child Find, we're obligated to then see if the student is experiencing a substantial impairment to a major life activity. So it's really it's the activities that we engage in to locate these students and make sure that we're identifying them appropriately.
Marinda, we had another question come in.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for answering that one. The next question is the state looking at a wide variation in students identified with disabilities in Oregon? And then it goes on to say that districts range from less than 2% and over 5% with 504 plans. Cultural norms have shifted. Many privileged families are seeking out identification for disabilities based on diagnoses from private providers. Is there a reasonable number? Is there work being done on this at the state and national level?
So that's a big question, and I will go deeper a little bit into that. We know 504s are on the rise, and I'll tell you kind of why a little bit later. We do range from districts having almost 10% of their student population with students identified under Section 504 to 0%. And we definitely see a imbalance on who is identified under Section 504. So white students are exponentially more likely to be identified under Section 504 than any other racial group, with the lowest that I can find as far as like groupings with EL students being at 0.9% of that student population being identified. So there is no guidance from the federal government saying, hey, there's a cap on Section 504 eligibility. I think a more interesting question is, are we accurately locating students who are experiencing a substantial limitation to a major life activity? And are we adequately locating all those students, or are we just relying on the louder parents to get that need met, which tends to overrepresent some student groups over other student groups? So I would do I think an interesting question is to look at who in your buildings or districts are being identified, and are we missing, or are there gaps in service for other students?
Great.
Anything else before I move on?
Yeah, there's one more. Do you
Okay.
want to take it or do you want to wait? It's kind of off of the question that you just answered.
Sure, if it's relevant.
Yeah. So a question is, in a time where students are or could be diagnosed with anxiety, how can school counselors manage 504s for all of them? Is there any discussion about anxiety being more of a tier 1 issue, or will counselors just need to keep their heads above water?
So I think I'll answer that as we go. So the next slide is really about defining substantial limitation. And then we're going to go more into like that school counselor role and potentially advocating for a distribution of responsibility, right? Like maybe if we see ourselves as facilitators, but not the person that's responsible for everything, then that burden can feel less high. But I also want to acknowledge that we're increasing nationally with 504 eligibility, and there has not been a national movement to allocate funds towards Section 504, which then leads to folks taking that responsibility on for case management without associated funds. So that's a national issue because it is not a grant formula, it is a civil right. But let me talk about substantial limitation, because I know that anxiety is one of those ones that are kind of coming up, and this can sort of help with that idea. So a substantial limitation is a condition under which an individual can perform a major life activity as compared to the general population, so same age group, same grade level, who can perform that same activity. And we have to think about, can they do it? What's the effort? What's the time that it takes? Now, when I'm saying this, we also have to realize that students in 2023 are different than the students we had in 2018. So when we're talking about anxiety, we also have to understand that the threshold for anxiety might need to be raised slightly, because we're comparing students to the general population. And if the general population generally is more anxious, that threshold has just raised slightly. Now, it might not be huge enough to say, oh, well, students who have a diagnosis aren't going to qualify, and that's going to be a hard sell. But I would say, like, you need to compare your 8th grade students to this year's 8th grade students nationally, not to how 8th grade students were prior to the pandemic. So that's one of the thresholds that you can kind of think about. We are not going to have 86% of students qualify under Section 504 for anxiety. That is not what that definition allows for. The other thing is that sometimes students are just eligible. Okay, so it's possible that a student is eligible because they have these symptoms, but they have mitigating measures in place. So let's say they're taking medication and it's relieving the anxiety and they don't really need a service plan. It's possible for us to just identify the student as technically eligible so that we're making sure their civil rights are in place, but we're not obligating anyone to a service plan because at the moment it's not necessary. You can always write an accommodation plan later, but what we're not going to do is to ignore the fact that this student has a substantial limitation to a major life activity when there's no mitigating measures in place. And then we also need to know that it's possible for a student to qualify with a temporary impairment. Generally speaking, OCR sees that as an impairment that lasts 6 months or less. And they just say, don't have a blanket statement that students aren't going to qualify if they have a temporary impairment. You need to always consider that on a case-by-case basis. So you would have to consider as a team, is their impairment substantially enough, even if it's temporary, to warrant civil rights protections and potentially a service plan. So that's kind of the first part of the answer to what you were talking about, that threshold a little bit has raised potentially if we're seeing generally as a population, the anxiety rates are just higher for most people. The other thing to know is that we really cannot have an intervention model that becomes a barrier to students who have a known or suspected disability. So remember, Section 504 is civil rights protections. But if we are saying, well, we need to do 6 weeks of RTI and TSS before we consider the student, even though we know they have a diagnosis of ADHD, that would be a violation under OCR. They'd say, no, you know he has a diagnosis of ADHD. You need to evaluate whether that's a substantial impairment. And then you can provide intervention as you're going through that process, but you're not going to have that as a standard for which they need to kind of push through before that could be considered. So if you're working through teams, making these decisions, reminding those teams that we're not going to create barriers for students to have civil rights protections. We can certainly continue intervention protocols as we're determining the needs of the student. So the value, is there any other questions, Beth, before I keep going?
We did get another one. You kind of answered a little bit, but if a student has a health issue and we're not asking for a medical statement, how do we make a determination? I think you started to address it with a team, but maybe you can elaborate more.
Yep, and we'll go through that sort of right now, because it has to do with, like, how do you evaluate and what data do you use and who is part of that decision making. So first and foremost, the evaluation should have some type of process. So upon child find, we locate a student who may be experiencing a disability. There's a team that's going to decide, is this a 504 evaluation or an evaluation for special education? And then once that decision is made and we decide, okay, it's 504, then you have to get parent consent. So we don't move forward with evaluation unless you go through due process without parental consent. So you would glean parent consent and then move forward with an evaluation. And I'll go through data points that can help that evaluation. But basically what OCR says is you need to have multiple data points from multiple sources, and it does not have to be extensive. You need to have enough information that's going to determine whether a student has a substantial impairment, and that's going to inform accommodations. If you don't know what the accommodations are going to be, it's probably because you don't have enough information, and that means the evaluation's not, it's not clean enough. So we'll go over some sources of data, but generally speaking, this is about gleaning data that exists within the system, because unless the parent can provide a medical statement or other information, or a provider wants to provide that information, most of that information you could probably find within your system. And OCR would say, if you don't have that, that's not the fault of the parent and the student. That's your system that's not faulty, and they would consider that problematic. So we have to use the data that we can glean to paint a picture of the student's needs. So once we have enough information to determine that, then you go through the eligibility that's going to state whether or not a student has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, and if they need a service plan. So if there is no mitigating measures in place, or it's not in remission, and they need to have a service plan, then you would write the accommodation plan. And that could be done during the eligibility process. Sometimes this is almost all condensed into a very short process, because everything's fairly known, and it can be a turnaround like this. For some students, we need to understand them more deeply, so it's a lengthier process, but we're not denying the access to FAPE when we know that the student has a need. So what OCR says is this process could take upwards of 60 school days, because Section 504 does not provide a timeline. So when that is the case, when Section 504 kind of is silent, then we lean on IDEA, and IDEA says 60 school days. So OCR says, yeah, Section 504 is pretty silent on timeline. You can rely on that IDEA's 60 school days, but if that's not reasonable, then that's not timely enough. So let's say a student comes to you with insulin-dependent diabetes. That's a life-threatening condition. They need access to FAPE right now. You're not going to wait 60 school days to figure that out. You're going to be reasonable in your turnaround. And then this eligibility that they have for Section 504 is a 3-year eligibility, generally speaking. So in most instances, you would want to reevaluate every 3 years, in accordance, kind of leaning again on IDEA, saying we need to do a 3-year reevaluation. And then any other time, well, you have to reevaluate at a significant change of placement. So let's say a student goes to online academy, or the student is excluded from school for 10 days or more, or a student goes on an abbreviated school day, we would have to reevaluate and bring more data to the table. You can also reevaluate as requested, or if the condition changes, let's say that anxiety is improved or it's worsened, you might reevaluate with more information and to determine their needs and service. And then most districts request that the case manager review plans on an annual basis, and that's not an OCR mandate. It is a best practice. And I would say, yes, that's probably a good thing to do. We do know that parents need access to their parental rights and procedural safeguards document on an annual basis anyways. So you might as well review that and share with them their rights, and make sure that everything's feeling on the up and up for everybody, and no revisions need to be made. So as far as evaluations are concerned, again, it's multiple data points from multiple sources without a huge burden on a family to provide information to prove a disability. That is not the family's responsibility. So we can secure information from the records that we do have, like academic records, maybe attendance records, behavior records, teacher input, work samples, parent input, and then any type of previous special education evaluation. That is like basically all you need. It's got everything there. Psych reports that are in-house or maybe gleaned from the outside. And whatever you can get that's medical or mental health related is great. It just can't be a precondition to a student becoming eligible. How are we doing, Beth, on questions?
Good. We got another one that's come in. At this person's school, they have a pretty major attendance issue, And it makes it a bit tricky because teachers are having trouble doing observation feedback, and just wondering how to navigate that. Also, it sounds like it can sometimes be completely unclear whether the poor attendance is related to the diagnosis.
So I would, and I mean, there's a lot that goes into that, and I don't have I'm not going to give you like a clear cut answer because Section 504 is not clear cut. It's very gray. But that data point, the attendance data point, is indicating if the student potentially has a substantial limitation to a major life activity, right? That's an important data point. So there might not be a teacher observation because you don't have much of that. There, and maybe there's a little bit, but you're going to use things like attendance. I think are really good, depending on the reason. So if there's a medical diagnosis and they're not attending because of a medical issue, it would be a really hard sell to not find them as 504 eligible. Some folks struggle with like anxiety disorders and saying, I don't know if they're 504 eligible. Again, it might be a hard sell to say that they're not if they're unable to attend school. But you can also do other things like, I think a functional behavior assessment for students with internalizing disorders is really helpful because it gives you an understanding why they're experiencing school refusal. And a behavior intervention plan can support them potentially with some attendance stuff and be attached to their, or like linked to their 504. Empathy interviews can also give you more data. So when you can catch that kid to do an empathy interview and use that as part of your data point, that could be useful. But you need to use that attendance data as part of the rationale for the student's impairment, right? So it does paint a picture there too. I can't say everything's case by case. So I can't say that all kids who have attendance issues and a diagnosis are at 504 eligible. I don't know that at all. I know that they probably should be considered for eligibility. Okay, so we've talked about the civil rights, right? First and foremost, this is about disability civil rights. And then we talked about kind of the process of finding these students and having them become eligible with our system. Now I'm going to express what really how you can maybe leverage other folks in your systems so that not everything's on your shoulders as the case manager. Okay, so when we talk about roles and responsibilities, the big picture role is one of District 504 coordinator. That is a mandated role. Okay, so the federal government has said that there has to be a district coordinator who's overseeing non-discrimination, receiving complaints and violations, that helps with process and procedures and making sure that the building case managers have the supports that they need. So the federal government says you need that person. They have to oversee and those kind of the big picture part of Section 504. So hopefully you know who that 504 district coordinator is, because that's a good resource for you. And most likely you're sitting in the role of either some version of a case manager or building coordinator, depending the vocabulary that your district uses. And that role really should be one of facilitation, right? It's the one that's getting all the gears moving, but what it's not is a decision maker. Okay, you're not deciding if the student's going to go through a 504 evaluation. You're not deciding if they're eligible. You're not deciding what the accommodation plan is going to be, because that comes from the 504 team. So I really want you to wear that hat as facilitator and step away from any time where you feel like you're making unilateral decisions, both because that's too much burden to carry, and it's technically could be violating student civil rights because OCR says we need to do team-based decision making. So the 504 team, by definition, through OCR, indicates that 3 roles must be represented on the 504 team, and whoever fulfills that role it kind of depends, because the team kind of fluctuates depending on the needs of the student. So you have to have someone who's knowledgeable of the student, someone knowledgeable of the evaluation data, and someone knowledgeable of the placement or the environment. That way, no one person is making a unilateral decision. So that could look like you and the parent, but that's not going to be all. It's also going to be depending on the condition that the student has, the classroom teacher, the school nurse, the behavior specialist, an administrator. It could be the speech path.
I think we're
It could
just gonna have to sit down either now.
We got a talker out there.
I mean,
There we go. But you're going to pull a team together that allows you to not be the expert. If they have a medical condition that you don't understand, that's okay, because you're going to have that expert there as part of the team. You are not the medical expert. Most likely you did not go to medical or nursing school. That was never a precondition to you having this role. So finding those people who, and again, like if the student is engaged in athletics, maybe it's the athletic director that needs to be part of that team. Or if they have a life-threatening allergy, a food-based allergy, someone from nutrition services should be there. So you're getting those folks at the table who need to be there to make the right decisions. And then implementation comes out through that accommodation plan. So who is responsible for that accommodation plan? And those folks are implementing those accommodations as written. And that could mean that different staff have different responsibilities, but really most of your role is within facilitation unless you are also taking on some implementation responsibilities.
Marinda, we're getting some questions coming in. Do you want to hold on them or do you want to address some of them?
If it's related to like roles, responsibilities, teams, such.
There's one, is there a required certification level for 504 case managers? So could a classified staff person hold this position?
They could hold the position at you went through probably a school counseling program and very little training in section 504, right? The problem with having someone who doesn't have a bigger picture educational experience is understanding the complexities of the civil rights parts of this, right? And so if that does that person have the authority and wherewithal to receive a civil rights complaint and know how to move that through a complaint process? Does that person have the time with the district, like the hours to be able to do the meetings for the students and the parents and all of that, and the access to student records that you might have? So it's going to become more about what is reasonable for that role. But the case manager role is really more of a local decision. The only thing that OCR really mandates overall is that there's a district coordinator and that we're doing what we're saying we're doing. And it's smart to document because then it creates a paper trail. But otherwise, OCR doesn't have a lot of guidance on some of the more nuanced things that are kind of a local control district level decision. Okay, so what is your responsibilities? First and foremost, remember we're talking about non-discrimination. So we want to make sure that the district is keeping an eye on what could be discriminatory towards the student, and you're having that lens as well. So an example of that is monitoring behavioral referrals for your students who are eligible under section 504, because it is mandated that a student who has 10 days of out of school suspension, cumulative or altogether at once, must go through a manifestation determination process to determine whether that behavior is a manifestation of their behavior. And if you're not tracking that, it could be an oversight on admin. So it helps if you're at least in communication with the administrators or those who are responsible for behavior to be tracking when students are getting close to that 10-day. Additionally, one of the practices that is under scrutiny right now is a shortened school day or abbreviated school day. Any students who are protected under section 504 really need to have a functional behavior assessment and a behavior intervention plan implemented prior to a change of placement. And that could be considered an abbreviated school day. That is a change of placement because it's removing access to educational benefit when they're having a shortened day. So you're tracking which students are on a shortened day, or do they have non-discrimination civil rights protections because of their disability. And then you need to respond to or report to disability-based harassment and bullying and follow a protocol. And that might mean referring it on to admin because they take that. But noticing when your students have been experiencing harassment or discrimination and making sure that protocol is instigated. And then you're also making sure that the students are accessing FAPE. So that means that their accommodation plan is appropriate and revised as needed, that they're actually gaining access to educational benefit. And you want to make sure that you're supporting transfer students so that they're gaining access to FAPE upon starting school, and they're able to access their schooling when they enroll in your programs. Any questions coming up, Beth?
Yeah, there's one that is based on what you just talked about. So do in-school suspensions count towards a 10-day manifestation determination for Section 504?
Typically, no, but it kind of could depend on how you do in school. So if the student still has access to educational benefits, so let's say they're able to access their instruction and have someone overseeing, like if they need to be able to get through the unit along with the rest of the students just in a separate location, that doesn't fall within that requirement for manifestation determination. But if they're completely isolated and not engaging in their education, then there could be an argument that they're not accessing FAPE, and that's exclusion. In the same way that if a student has a shortened school day, they're not accessing FAPE, there's a part of their day that they're missing. So that is school exclusion.
Marinda, we have one more. What if the change of placement is due to inability to come to a full day of school due to like chemo treatments?
Yeah, so you'll just want the team to come together and talk about what that looks like, document that, talk about when you would know that student can re-access their in-building education and how much access to FAPE they can gain outside of the school system too. So potentially, is there ways for them to engage with instruction at home that's not going to be overwhelming for that student? But again, I would say that that's a team-based decision, and you document that through the team. And we'll see where legislation goes, because there's lots of conversation around things like this and what more regulations might be surrounding, but we won't know that until the end of legislative session. So I'm not going to even make it a stressful thing yet. Okay, so some common parent concerns that arise are ones that I feel like can be really clean. They can be cleaned up pretty easily. So one problem that I hear a lot of is just them not knowing if the 504 plan is still being implemented. They're just at a loss as to what's happening at the school. And a solution really is to communicate at least annually, if not more, and especially if you're like in a semester or quarter system, potentially at transition, that the plan has been shared with the teachers. This is how they have access to it, and the plan's being followed, and making sure that the parent annually gets their parental rights and procedural safeguard documentation so that they know that they're still in the loop, and they can ask for certain things as a parent with a student with a disability. Another problem is not hearing back from the case manager when the parent has concerns. And again, sometimes this is like timeliness of response. So even if you can't get to it right away, let them know as soon as possible. Just say like, I got your email and I will respond to it as soon as possible. You should hear from me within however much of a time period. But what happens is parents get really stressed and overwhelmed, and then they go to the principal, or they go to the superintendent, or then they call me. And the most effective strategy is usually within the most local system. So solving problems at the school is really going to help the student and the parent and your system the most. If the parent's not feeling heard, they often push beyond, and those get more complicated. And oftentimes the student isn't better served anyways. Delayed 504 meetings when a meeting is requested. Just communicate with parents that you understand they want to review, or they want a 504 meeting, but you need to assemble a team, and school systems sometimes take time, right? Like you can't just get a teacher and the school nurse and everyone together in a 24-hour period. So just to describe the process and when they could expect a meeting to be held. So the theme is communicate and communicate and communicate. And it's best if you can document that communication, because if there was ever a concern that arose, you could say, this is the process that I followed.
Marinda, can you answer one more question that is related to parent So a question came in asking, do you have to have parent consent to implement a 504 plan for a student you found eligible?
So technically you need consent for evaluation and notification throughout. So you don't necessarily need consent, but I would say involve the parent as much as you can. But once the parent has signed consent for to move forward with an eligibility, your requirements are more regarding notification. So sorry, my work phone keeps ringing. So yeah, like you could do a revision of a 504 plan, let's say without parent consent, but as much as you can involve the parent is going to relieve some of the distress that might arise from that.
And does that have to be a written consent, or can it be verbal?
I would say that's local decision, and the smartest way to move forward is written, because there's really no way to sit back on anything but a written consent. And hopefully you have some type of consent form that's very informed, right? So it's describing this is what 504 is, this is how we evaluate for it. Because otherwise, if parents might not even understand that it's allowing their students to have access to protected civil rights. Now, is it required? I don't see anything in OCR regs that say it's required. Most districts lean on written consent because it's the only way to prove that it happened, right? It gets really complicated if we don't have any proof of consent. And generally speaking, like if you're going to do an FBA, you need consent. You need to give parents access to the parental rights procedural safeguards anyways. So there has to be some kind of like connection there happening so that consent can be gleaned during that time. Okay, so your supports, just remember that you're not in this alone. Utilize the people who are within your system that can help kind of disseminate those responsibilities throughout. So first and foremost, use your teams. If you feel like you don't have the answer, you don't have to. You don't need to know the answer. Go back to team-based decision making and relieve yourself of the burden of having a unilateral answer to any one thing, whether it's an accommodation, eligibility, what have you. Utilize your school nurse for any condition that is health related, either as a consultant or as a team member if like it's a life-threatening condition. If you tell me you don't have a school nurse, I'll be worried for your district, because they're the only ones that can write individualized health plans, and a lot of these students are going to have IHPs as well. So you are never writing a 504 that looks like an IHP, because you are not a medical professional. So instead, you're leaning on the support of your school nurse to do the IHP. You can link that to the 504, but you're never feeling like you're making any health related decisions ever. Your 504 district coordinators, so that person does the oversight and you have questions, lean on them, invite them to meetings that are difficult. And then your administrator for issues of implementation. You are not in HR. You need to maintain relationships with the teachers that you work with for all the other reasons that you do your job. So if the teachers are not providing accommodation, lean on the administrator to do more of the HR work to make sure the teacher is doing what is mandated by federal law. Okay, I'm going to push to the end, and then whatever questions we have remaining, I will answer because I have a minute left and I respect your time. So the one thing to consider I know that ASCA does not align with 504 coordinator role for school counselors. Like, I'm very aware of this. I lived it. There are times where it really does make sense. And sometimes I think that wearing that hat on, okay, this does make sense to have both kind of this tier 3 support responsibility for the student and case manager role responsibility, like it can align. So I really want you to think about that piece of it too. So for example, there are students that you consistently work with who will be or are 504 eligible, and you probably are the best person to case manage them. So if they're coming into the counseling office a lot due to emotional mental health issues, they may be 504 eligible. They might be on your case. You might be case managing them for that. If they have check-in and out plans or behavior intervention plans due to externalizing behavioral issues, they are maybe 504 eligible. If a student has suicidal ideation, requires suicide risk assessment, or is displaying non-suicidal self-injury, then they might likely be 504 eligible. If a student has attendance issues or their own attendance plan related to health or mental health conditions, again, they might qualify under section 504. And any of your students who have been in treatment facilities or hospitalizations are likely 504 eligible. So you might really think about your role, especially for these students where school counselor as case manager makes a lot of sense. And maybe talking with other folks about how to disseminate potentially other responsibilities of section 504. I'm going to leave this here because it's helpful for those of you who are working with College Board, but basically there are responsibilities that make it important. Well, there are things that are important that we identify students as 504 eligible and write those plans for them, because the only way for College Board to accept those accommodations is through documentation that they've been necessary over time. So when folks say like the teacher provides accommodations to all kids, that's great. But if the student has a disability, it's not written in a 504 plan, then they're not going to get that accommodation for the PSAT or AP exam. So it's a good rationale when folks are kind of pushing back on why this should be written in a plan. This is case management distribution by grade. And the one thing I want to acknowledge is, generally speaking, we see an increase in 504s over time with a peak in high school, which makes sense. So our high school counselors are bearing the burden of probably more to case manage when it comes to 504. I also want to acknowledge that probably our youngsters who are 504 eligible have more complex eligibilities, and maybe you're more involved as case manager and service provider for those students. But this is kind of what the numbers are looking like. So basically, remember that this is required by law, that we need to support students with disability and accommodate and protect students who have a substantial limitation to a major life activity. If this role is overburdening your system or your program, then working with your district and administrator and advocating. In some ways to do that is doing exactly what ASCA says. Do your time task analysis. Just to describe to the district how much time you're spending on 504 case management compared to the rest of the initiatives of your department, and compared to maybe 5 years ago if you were doing the same job previously, and start to work with the district, the administration, on how to relieve the burden of case management enough to where you can do all parts of your job, and that we're not accidentally denying child find because we're so overwhelmed that we don't even notice that the students probably should be evaluated for section 504. And when we get flooded as case managers with too much stress and responsibility, sometimes we become less responsive to what's kind of blatantly in our face, but we can't see it anymore because we're emotionally overwhelmed. So notice your response to this type of training, right, with all the responsibilities, and maybe start working with your teams, your building, your counseling department, your district on how do we support this role so that we are giving students access to their federal civil rights. So there are increases in 504. There are numbers here I've shown in 2016 when we first started taking the data. 2.6% of Oregon students were 504 eligible. Now this year we're at 3.8%, with anywhere from 0% in some districts to about 10 or more in some districts. And that makes sense because the guidance that's come from OCR has opened the pool of who is 504 eligible. Now we can take on students who don't have a medical diagnosis. We can't consider mitigating measures. That's opened the pool for eligibility. And of course, we're going to get more. And as stigma kind of decreases around mental health diagnosis and service, that also opens the pool because we become aware and knowledgeable of students experiencing mental health issues. So the rate is going up nationally, it's going up in the state, it's going up. And that is a truth that we need to discuss as a system. And we are a local control state. So your system is your district on how we support case managers and teachers, right? Because they're going to be responsible for implementation. So with that said, and I know I've gone over my time, this is you will receive this with active links, but that is my email address, and I am happy to consult and provide feedback or find links to justify any of your 504 kind of processes. I also have an ODE 504 coordinator and case manager listserv. You can find that on the ODE website, or you can click here from the slide deck that you will receive. But there are multiple ways for you to continue to get information, with my intention of providing more and more information through districts, ESDs, and virtual platforms such as this, so that you don't feel like you're doing this on your own. With that said, it's 4:05. I have the capacity to stay on for a short while longer. Those of you who need to leave, feel free. But if you have any questions and you want to throw them in the chat, and I'm also going to try to look for that link for, let's see, where is it? No, that's not it. For
Hours.
Say it again.
You have the office hours link.
Yes, I'm going to try
Thank
to. There,
you.
yeah, there we go. It's hard to do this all at the same time, so hold on.
I'm seeing lots of appreciation for you, Marinda. Thank you for today.
Absolutely. And again, like I totally acknowledge the roles that you have, and always use your resources. So don't feel like you're doing this alone, and reach out as needed. I think that's gonna work. It has multiple links, but there we go. Okay. Is there any last minute questions for good of the order before y'all log off?
I put one in the chat about College Board. So this time of year, especially, we get a lot of extra requests for 504s because it's, testing season. And they're just specifically looking for accommodations for College Board, not for education. And so we always kind of like, I'm just interested to hear your thoughts about that.
So again, I think it's going to have to go back to that idea of like, is this student experiencing a substantial physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities? If that's true and they do need access to FAPE, then we should proceed with that. You can always evaluate and say it's not substantial. But once a parent says my student has a disability, that instigated child find. So for us to not move forward with some type of way to say the student is or is not eligible could be problematic. However, do know that with College Board, a diagnosis from a diagnostician is required. So they have to have a diagnosis from a diagnostician that's recent, and documentation over time that the student needs that accommodation to access FAPE and testing. So waiting until the testing season is actually the worst strategy ever. We should be seeing these students needing this accommodation and documenting this accommodation for months, if not years prior to that, because College Board will deny it if it's like 2 months beforehand they had a 504 written. Like they could say no. So that is kind of the leverage there too, that we need to be identifying these students early on. And when I was working at the middle school, oftentimes I was advocating for students at 8th grade. And when parents are like, I don't know if they need testing accommodations, I'm like, well, as we're talking about it, if we don't have something that said, because oftentimes the parents would say, well, the teacher does this already. And I'm like, yeah, but College Board doesn't know that. So we just need to document that. So 8th grade, 9th grade, now it's 10th grade, they're taking the PSAT, there's justification for that accommodation.